David Henderson had always considered himself a man of simple pleasures. His routine was precise, predictable, and devoid of surprises. He woke at exactly 6:30 a.m., brewed a cup of coffee, and ate the same breakfast every morning: 2 eggs, lightly scrambled, a piece of toast, and a glass of orange juice. His commute was uneventful, the same stoplight patterns every day, the same office chatter at his insurance company. Even the weather seemed to comply with his unspoken request for mild conditions: never too hot, never too cold. But that morning, something was off. Something he couldn't quite place. It started innocuously enough. His kitchen smoke detector shrieked to life, an electronic shrill that echoed through the walls. David, bleary-eyed and disoriented, jumped out of his chair, heart leaping to his throat. He reached for the fire extinguisher, but when he looked toward the stove, he saw nothing but a tiny flicker of flame, a grease fire that hadn't even grown big enough to be worried about. In fact, it should have been a trivial problem. A minor inconvenience, yet David didn't feel the typical panic that would normally grip someone in such a situation. In fact, he felt strangely content. There was a bizarre sense of satisfaction, like a small fire was the most wonderful thing in the world. His heart didn't race in fear, he felt no rush to stop it, no dread of impending disaster. Instead, a cool, almost amused detachment crept over him. He was mildly amused, in fact. And why not? It was just a little grease fire. The kind of thing that could be solved with a bit of common sense and a fire extinguisher. But as he approached the stove, towel in hand, trying to put out the flame, his phone buzzed, and his neighbor's voice exploded from the speaker: "David, your house is on fire." His voice was panicked, sharp, high-pitched. David blinked. His neighbor, Mark, was clearly in a panic, but David couldn't fathom why. The fire was contained. The situation was under control. And yet, Mark's fear was palpable, he could almost taste it. David frowned, confused. He'd never felt so aware of another person's fear before. His heart suddenly thudded in his chest, but it wasn't his own emotion. It was Mark's. This deep, raw fear that surged in waves from his neighbor's words, his voice trembling as if the entire world was collapsing. That was the first strange thing. Then, it got worse. A few moments later, his doorbell rang. A group of neighbors had gathered on his porch, wide-eyed and frantic, faces flushed with an almost absurd level of terror. A woman, Kathy, stood at the front, her hands wringing nervously, her face pale. "David, you've got to get out of there. The whole block's gonna burn down if you don't." David's mouth went dry. He wanted to reassure them, to laugh it off as the small incident it was. But instead, a feeling welled up in his chest, a deep anxiety that wasn't his own. He suddenly felt a pressing need to escape. The fear was so overwhelming, it seemed to cloud his judgment. His breath quickened, yet there was still no fire. The kitchen wasn't even close to burning down. How could he feel this way? David took a step back and shook his head. The dizziness subsided, and he tried to focus. What was happening to him? He couldn't explain it. His heart raced, yet there was no apparent danger. Something was off. He glanced at Kathy, Mark, and the others, but he could no longer just see them. It was as if he could sense their innermost feelings, every flicker of fear, every ounce of anxiety. Their emotions were spilling out, crashing into his mind like waves, and it wasn't just theirs. It was the sense of powerlessness in the air, the unspoken frustration of each individual caught in a world that refused to be predictable. David was awash in it. A tidal wave of chaotic emotions that had no source other than his own sudden, inexplicable ability to feel the emotions of everyone around him. What the hell is happening? David muttered to himself that it wasn't just the panic of the fire or his neighbor's worry. It was everything. He could taste the frustration of the couple next door who were fighting over money, the sorrow of a man on the street who had just lost his job, the bitterness of a teenager walking to school, the unspoken resentment in the gaze of the delivery driver across the street. It was as if the entire world had been turned into an emotional factory, and David was the one who was absorbing every toxic byproduct, every drop of discontent, every undercurrent of suffering. At that moment, the floodgates burst open. The city outside was suddenly alive with fury. He could hear the honking of horns, the shouting of pedestrians, the palpable sense of dread that filled every face. He stumbled back into his living room, clutching his temples, trying desperately to make sense of the chaos now spilling into his mind. Hours later, the city had descended into a full-blown crisis. People were acting erratically. Emotions that should have been personal had become public displays of agony. David could no longer keep up. The feelings, the overwhelming, suffocating feelings, had taken over every inch of his being. Fear, anger, frustration, confusion, anxiety, pain, everything was too much. He couldn't breathe without inhaling someone else's misery. It was as though the entire city had contracted a disease, a plague of emotions that no one could escape. David wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew he needed to get away. The only way to stop it, to shut out this torrent of emotions, was to isolate himself. He retreated to his apartment, locking the door behind him. But even there, in his solitary space, the flood of emotions refused to leave him alone. The walls seemed to pulse with the angry voices of his neighbors, the sorrow of strangers, the helpless rage of the world. His body trembled under the weight of it all. David tried everything, closing his eyes, putting on noise-canceling headphones, even taking sleeping pills, but it made no difference. The emotions came crashing in, louder and more persistent than before. He couldn't focus on anything. He couldn't escape it. Late that night, exhausted, David stumbled into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, hoping to find something that might help him. But as he stared at the dim light of the fridge, he realized something. He was feeling their emotions. The sorrow of the homeless man on the corner, the panic of the barista across the street, the hidden rage of the mechanic who fixed his car last week, they were all here, swirling in his mind, demanding his attention. And as he looked around his apartment, David felt the weight of something else, a terrifying realization that it wasn't just his neighbors, his friends, or even the strangers. David was no longer just perceiving emotions. He was absorbing them. They were inside him, and there was no escape. David sat on the edge of his couch, trembling, staring at the unblinking lights of his refrigerator. It wasn't the first time he'd felt like this, intense, overwhelmed, as though his skin had become paper-thin, letting everything bleed through. But this was different. This time, there was no escape. He wasn't just observing these emotions. They weren't floating by, passing in and out of his consciousness like stray thoughts. No, they were him. Every emotion that flickered from the world outside, every fear, every rage, every joy, he felt it deep inside, like it was woven into his very being. His breathing was shallow, and he was starting to feel nauseous. It was as though his entire body was being crushed under the weight of an invisible, oppressive force. He couldn't think straight. His mind was tangled in a mess of emotions that weren't his own but felt more real than his own thoughts ever had. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, and it was like a wave that came in, broke over him, and then pulled back only to crash again harder. And with each wave, the world outside seemed to be falling apart just a little bit more. People were snapping. His neighbors had already started acting strangely, more paranoid than usual. But it wasn't just them. The entire city had fallen under some kind of collective emotional madness. The streets outside his apartment were wild, people yelling at each other for reasons that made no sense, entire groups breaking out into tears or anger at the slightest inconvenience. That he wanted to scream, to break free, but even the thought of screaming made him feel the frustration of everyone who had ever been stuck in a moment of complete and total rage. He imagined a day where he would walk into a room and feel nothing but his own quiet thoughts. A day where he wouldn't have to shoulder the weight of the world's misery. David had always considered himself a calm, rational person. He didn't get swept up in the drama of things. But this was different. This wasn't just feeling someone else's frustration. This was being pulled into it. He could feel the sharp, prickling heat of every minor conflict in the city. It burned inside him, leaving him raw, exposed. He couldn't even remember the last time he'd felt any of his own emotions, his own thoughts. It was like all of them had been drowned under a torrent of other people's feelings. David jumped at the sound of a knock at the door. He had no idea how long he'd been sitting there, but now, the sound of another person, another emotion, made his pulse spike. He stood, unsteady on his feet, and walked slowly to the door. His hand hovered over the handle, but he couldn't make himself turn it. Every time he reached for the door, he felt it, an unholy blend of dread, fear, and an intense desire to hide. The emotions in his chest surged, his throat constricting, his heartbeat quickening. "David," came a voice, muffled through the door. It was Lena, the psychiatrist who had lived a few floors down. He hadn't spoken to her much, but in the last few days, he'd seen her eyes flicker with an odd mix of concern and curiosity whenever their paths crossed in the hallway. At first, he'd thought it was just normal politeness. But now, as he pressed his forehead to the door, he realized that Lena had sensed something, too. She knew something was wrong. David opened the door just a crack, feeling a burst of anxiety well up inside him from the brief interaction, but he couldn't let her see him like this, his wild, panicked state. It wasn't just the overwhelming flood of emotions that made him want to hide. It was the fear that he couldn't stop it. Lena looked at him with quiet concern. She had a calm presence that, at one point, would have put David at ease. But right now, her gaze was a weapon. The vulnerability in her eyes, the subtle fear he could feel emanating from her, it felt like an electric shock through his entire body. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said softly. "But I think we need to talk." David almost slammed the door in her face. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't even want to think about what was happening to him. But as her voice wove through the crack, weaving into his psyche with that strange, invasive awareness of her feelings, he found himself nodding. He opened the door wide. "I'm not sure what's happening," David said, his voice barely more than a whisper. He was afraid his voice would crack. It felt like too much of him was breaking apart, like pieces of himself were being consumed by everything around him. "I can feel everything. All the emotions of everyone. I don't know how to stop it. I can't think straight." Lena stepped into his apartment, looking around with a calmness that almost infuriated him. She'd always been collected, in control, poised. And right now, the flood of emotions he could feel from her was an unsettling combination of concern and distress. She was worried. No, she was afraid. But more than that, she knew something was wrong. And that made David feel even more vulnerable. "You're experiencing a heightened form of empathy," she said after a pause, her voice gentle but firm. "This isn't just normal sensitivity to others' emotions, David. What you're feeling is affecting not just you, but everyone around you. You're projecting it. They can feel what you feel, too." David shook his head. "No. This isn't just empathy. This is something else." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to block out the storm of emotions. But there was no stopping it. His pulse thrummed in his temples as he felt an overwhelming sense of unease from Lena. She was scared, too. And that fear, her fear, crawled inside him, making his chest tight. "I know," Lena said softly, taking a small step toward him. "But you need to understand something. You're not alone in this. This plague of emotions is real. It's spreading through the city. People are feeling things they can't control, things they don't understand. But you," she paused, looking carefully at David, "you're at the center of it. And it's going to keep spreading as long as you let it." David's stomach lurched. I'm causing it?" Lena nodded. "In a way, yes. Your ability to absorb and amplify emotions is creating a feedback loop. It's like a virus, but an emotional one. The more you feel, the more it spreads. And the more it spreads, the more you feel. David felt dizzy. His body had already been overwhelmed by this emotional hurricane, and now, Lena's words made it worse. His legs buckled slightly beneath him as the weight of the world's sorrow, anger, and confusion settled even heavier in his chest. "How do I stop it?" he gasped, barely able to keep his voice steady. "How do I make it stop?" Lena took a deep breath, looking at him with those soft, knowing eyes. "You need to find a way to block it. To cut yourself off from it. But more than that, you need to understand why you're letting it control you. You need to confront the emotions that are driving this. The ones you've been avoiding." David staggered backward, feeling the walls closing in. Lena's presence, while comforting in some way, only made the pressure of her concern even worse. She wasn't wrong. He'd been avoiding his emotions for so long. Hiding from the things that made him anxious, frustrated, or scared. But now, there was nowhere to hide. "Where do I even start?" he muttered. "I don't know how to deal with all of this." Lena smiled faintly. "You start by acknowledging that it's happening. By letting yourself feel what's inside. Not just what others feel, but what you feel." David shook his head. "I don't even know what I feel anymore. I just feel everything." "Exactly," she said softly. "And you have to learn how to sort through it. To figure out what's yours." David could hardly breathe. It was all too much, too fast, and he didn't think he could take much more. But there was a part of him that was listening, the part that realized that he couldn't live like this much longer. He couldn't just absorb every emotion, let every moment of panic and rage consume him. "You're right," he said, his voice shaking. "I have to fix this. I have to find a way to stop it." Lena nodded again, her eyes steady. "We'll figure it out together. But you have to be willing to face what's inside. You can't outrun it." David closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. The storm was still there, raging in the corners of his mind, but there was something else now, something small and fragile. A flicker of determination, as if he could finally see a path through the chaos, but even with that small glimmer of hope, the path ahead was uncertain, and David wasn't sure if he could ever be the same again. David nodded, trying to steady himself as the words sank in. The flood of emotions hadn't stopped, it never did. The fear, the anxiety, the anger, every emotional wave still crashed over him, relentless, pulling him deeper into the chaos. But somewhere, buried under the overwhelming weight, there was a flicker of something else, a willingness to fight it, a tiny thread of control he could hold on to. "You're right," he repeated, the words feeling like an anchor, heavy but grounding. "I can't keep doing this." Lena's eyes softened, and she took a step back, giving him space. "It won't be easy. But you have to start somewhere." David's thoughts were swirling, and he could barely keep them in order, but one thing was clear: he couldn't do this alone. Whatever was happening to him, whatever this plague of emotions was, he needed help to understand it, to control it. He needed to confront the chaos within, even if that meant facing things he had spent years avoiding. That he turned to look out the window, the city sprawling out beneath him, oblivious to the storm inside him. People walked down the streets, chatting, laughing, arguing, but David could feel the undercurrent of unease, the sharp edges of frustration and despair cutting through the air. It was everywhere. It was inside him. It was suffocating him. "What's the first step?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lena paused, thinking for a moment. "You need to isolate yourself. The more people you're around, the more their emotions are going to bleed into yours. You have to find a way to cut off the outside world, even if it's just temporarily. It won't be a permanent solution, but it'll give you space to start understanding what's really going on." David's chest tightened at the thought of isolation, but he understood. The noise, the constant barrage of feelings, he needed a break from it. His mind felt like it was teetering on the edge, a fragile glass about to shatter. "I can't stay locked in here forever," he muttered, though part of him longed to do just that. "How do I even begin to understand what's mine?" You've been running from your own feelings, David, Lena said gently. This is about facing them. Not avoiding them. They're in there, whether you like it or not. You need to look at what's underneath this emotional contagion. The panic, the anger, the fear, it's not just about the people around you. It's about what you're holding in yourself. David closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath. The idea of confronting his own emotions made him feel sick. He had spent so many years burying them, locking them away, pretending they weren't there. But Lena was right. He couldn't outrun them anymore. He had to face whatever was lurking beneath the surface. I don't know where to start, he admitted, his voice shaky. Start with the simplest thing, Lena said softly. What scares you the most? The question hit David like a slap. His heart skipped a beat, and suddenly, he was back in his childhood home, sitting in the dark, the sound of his father's shouting in the other room, the coldness in his mother's eyes. He hadn't thought about that in years, not consciously. But the fear, it was there. The same knot of terror that had settled in his chest as a child, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of never being able to escape his family's expectations. The memories came rushing back in full force, a wave of shame and helplessness that made his stomach churn. David's breath came faster, and the familiar sense of panic spread through him. He could feel his heart rate increasing, his pulse quickening, as though the past had caught up with him, dragging him down again. Lena's voice broke through the storm in his mind. David, focus. Don't get lost in it. You need to sit with it. Feel it, but don't let it consume you. He struggled to pull himself together, to separate the past from the present, but it was hard. The emotions had bled into each other, like oil mixing with water, becoming one unidentifiable mess. He could feel the fear from his childhood, the helplessness of his teenage years, the confusion, the rage that had always simmered under the surface. And it wasn't just his own. The people outside his apartment, their anxiety, their anger, it was all tangled up in him now. David shook his head, trying to steady himself. I can't do this. You can, Lena said. You've already started. You're here, facing it. You're not running anymore. The calm in her voice steadied him, like a hand reaching out in the middle of a storm. Slowly, David exhaled, trying to calm his breathing, trying to separate the emotions that weren't his from the ones that had always been inside him. It was harder than he thought. He had spent so many years pushing his own emotions away, afraid of feeling them. But now, they were all flooding in at once, and he couldn't ignore them anymore. The world's emotions were drowning him, and his own were too. I'm scared, David whispered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I'm scared I'll never be able to stop it. That I'll lose myself in all of this. Lena nodded, her gaze never leaving him. That's the first step, David. Acknowledging the fear. Once you face it, you can control it. You don't have to let it define you. You don't have to let it overwhelm you. David felt a shudder run through him, as though the dam inside him was beginning to crack. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he let himself feel the fear, deep, unrelenting fear, and for a brief moment, it was enough. He wasn't hiding from it. He wasn't avoiding it. He was in it. He was letting it wash over him. And even though it terrified him, there was a strange kind of relief in it. I can't keep doing this, he said, his voice breaking. I can't live like this anymore. Lena took a step closer, her expression soft, but resolute. You won't. But you need to commit to the process. You need to let yourself feel, and then let yourself go. Don't hold on to the past, David. Don't carry the weight of it. He nodded, but he wasn't sure if he believed her. The weight of his past, of his childhood, of his failures, it felt too heavy to let go of. But as Lena's steady gaze met his, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop carrying it. He stood there for a long moment, trying to steady his breath, trying to make sense of the mess of emotions inside him. The city outside was still alive with its own storm, but for a moment, he didn't feel it. His mind was still. And that was the first bit of peace he had felt in days. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice quiet, but steady. Lena smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting a quiet pride. "That's all you can do." David's hand trembled as he wiped his face, but there was something different now. A small flicker of hope, barely perceptible but there nonetheless. He couldn't escape the emotions that had taken over his life, but maybe, just maybe, he could learn to control them. He could start with the smallest steps, acknowledging the fear, facing the past, learning to feel again. As Lena left his apartment, he stood by the door for a long time, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The city outside was still burning with its own chaos, but he no longer felt as if it was consuming him. Not yet. But it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. David sat in the silence of his apartment long after Lena had left. The weight of the past, of everything he had tried so hard to ignore, still lingered, but something about facing it, just for a moment, had given him a strange sense of clarity. The noise of the world outside, the city still churning with its endless emotional storm, seemed a little quieter. Maybe it wasn't just the emotions of the people around him that he needed to control, maybe it was his own. He stood up and paced, his thoughts spinning. There was no magic solution, no simple fix to undo the flood of emotions that had overtaken him. But Lena was right. The first step was acknowledging what was inside. He had to feel it, all of it, without running from it. If he could do that, maybe he could take back some control. It was like standing on the edge of an abyss and trying to find the courage to jump in, knowing that there might be something waiting at the bottom, but also terrified of what he might find. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he almost ignored it, but something made him reach for it. It was a text from Mark, his neighbor. "David, we need to talk. Something is happening. It's getting worse." David's stomach churned. Mark's fear hit him like a punch in the gut. He could feel the urgency in those words, the panic clawing at Mark's mind. Whatever was happening, it was spiraling. And David knew, deep down, that it was his fault. His ability, or whatever this was, wasn't just affecting him anymore. It was affecting everyone. David had spent the last few days hiding away, trying to block out the world. But he couldn't stay locked up forever. He had to face it, face the consequences of what he'd done, and try to make things right, if that was even possible. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The moment he stepped outside, the pressure in his chest returned. The city felt thick with emotions, each one heavier than the last. It was suffocating, and the flood of despair, anger, and fear seemed to cling to his skin. But this time, it was different. He wasn't shutting himself off from it. He was walking through it, feeling it, confronting it head-on. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was the only way. As David walked down the hallway toward Mark's apartment, the air felt heavy with tension. The elevator dinged as it arrived, and as the doors slid open, the sound of shouting filtered through the hallway. It was a group of people gathered in front of Mark's door, all of them arguing in an incoherent frenzy, voices rising and falling in a chaotic rhythm. The emotions in the air were so thick David could barely breathe. He hesitated at the door, trying to gather himself. He didn't want to be the one to escalate the chaos, but there was no avoiding it now. He had to face the storm, not just the one inside him, but the one outside. His mind was on fire, caught between the flood of emotions and the need to keep it together. David pushed through the crowd, and the arguments paused when he stepped into the room. Mark, standing near the window, turned to him, his eyes wide with alarm. David felt the spike of panic rising within him as Mark's fear washed over him. "David," Mark said, his voice strained. It's getting worse. I'm scared, man. I've never seen anything like this. People are losing it." David swallowed hard, trying to find words that would help, that would make sense of the madness that had overtaken them. "I know," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry. This is my fault." Mark blinked in confusion. "Your fault? What are you talking about?" David closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts. The emotions were coming at him so fast, he had trouble keeping them straight. Fear, rage, frustration, all of it colliding in his mind. But it was his own fault, wasn't it? He had allowed this to happen. He had opened himself up to all of it, had let the world's emotions bleed into him, and now everyone was suffering because of it. I can feel everything," David explained, his words shaky. "Not just mine. Everyone's. It's like a plague. It spreads. It's affecting all of you, too." Mark's face twisted in disbelief. "Wait, you mean, all of this is because of you?" He gestured around the room, where people were still arguing, their voices rising. "But, David, we're all losing it. People are, they're starting to break down. What are we supposed to do? What can we even do?" David felt a knot form in his stomach. He couldn't fix this. He didn't know how. But he had to try. I'm going to find a way," David said, more to himself than to Mark. "But I need your help. I need all of you to stay calm. I need you to feel what's happening, but not let it take over." Mark looked at him, his fear palpable, but something in his expression softened. "You really think you can fix this? You're telling me you've got some kind of magic cure for all this chaos?" David took a deep breath. No magic cure. But I think if I can learn how to shut this down, to stop absorbing all this, maybe it will stop. Maybe I can stop it from spreading any further." He could see Mark was still skeptical, but then Mark looked over at the others in the room, and his eyes softened. There was a flicker of hope there, a tiny spark of something that wasn't just fear. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe David wasn't the only one who had the power to stop this. "All right," Mark said slowly. "If you think you can do it, I'll help. We'll try." "But if this goes sideways," David nodded, though he didn't have an answer. He didn't know what would happen next. All he knew was that he had to try. For the sake of everyone. For the sake of himself. "I don't know if this will work," David said, looking at the group of people still standing, their eyes wary, their emotions swirling in the air like a storm. "But we have to start somewhere. I need all of you to focus. Focus on your own emotions. Don't let them bleed into anyone else's." There was a murmur of uncertainty, but then, one by one, the others began to quiet, their eyes narrowing as they turned inward. David could feel the tension in the room, could feel the chaos still waiting to explode, but this time, he wasn't drowning in it. He was standing in the center, trying to hold his ground, to block out the flood of emotions that had once felt like they were tearing him apart. It wasn't easy. It felt like he was trying to push against a current that was pulling him under, but he didn't let go. He breathed, focused, and tried to separate himself from the tidal wave of feelings that kept crashing into him. Slowly, he could feel the chaos in the room starting to lessen, the overwhelming flood of emotions slowly calming. "Good," David whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's working. Just keep focusing. Keep calm." It took time. Minutes that felt like hours. But slowly, the noise in the room started to die down. People stopped shouting. The tension in the air began to dissipate. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a start. David opened his eyes, his body trembling from the effort, but for the first time in days, he felt something other than chaos. A flicker of control. A sense of hope. "We can do this," he said, his voice steady. "We can stop it. But we have to work together." Mark met his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he nodded. "Yeah. Let's do it." And for the first time, David felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this storm.